Hi. Do you know the health of open source dependencies? Introducing OpenSSF Scorecard. OpenSSF, like people spoke about that. One of the projects is I work and contribute is for Scorecard. Sorry, I don't work, but I contribute to Scorecard. Who am I? I'm Naveen Srinivasan. I work at Endor Labs. Endor Labs is a supply chain security startup. I'm not here to talk about Endor Labs right now at this moment over here. Other than Endor Labs, I contribute to open source. This is me last 2 years. I contribute every day. This is what I do. And then I'm a little obsessed about contributing to supply chain security right now. This is Brian. Brian couldn't come to this conference. Usually Brian and I present this. So I'm going to let Brian take. Brian was able to record and give an overview. Usually Brian does this initially, so I'm going to let Brian's recording play, and after that I'm going to take over.
Hi everyone. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there with you directly today. If you have any questions, still reach out to me after the presentation. My name's Brian Russell. I'm a product manager on Google's open source security team. And one of the things that I focus on is the OpenSSF scorecards. I wanted to take a few minutes, talk to you about the problem that Scorecards is seeking to solve. And I wanted to talk about what scorecards are and a little bit about how they've been doing so far. So let's start with that problem. If we take a look at this diagram, we start to see a little bit of what modern digital infrastructure looks like when you peel back the curtain and you look a little bit behind the scenes. You see a real mix of dependencies that projects have taken on. Some of them are big, some of them are small. A lot of them are not very obvious when it comes to how they're being maintained or exactly how risky some of these dependencies really are. This is especially true with security. We don't have a lot of insight into which projects are adhering to some really secure practices and which projects need some improvement. So the question starts to become, what if we had some of that insight? What if for some of these components, we were able to see projects that are doing really well, they're doing some really good things in terms of maintaining their security, making sure that they are developing all of their projects in a secure manner. Which projects need some improvement and which ones really need some improvement? This insight is what Scorecard is really looking to bring to the community. So let's take a look at what a scorecard is. Here's an example of one. This is actually a scorecard of the Scorecards project. I pulled this from deps.dev, and it shows a list of different heuristics or checks that this project adheres to. So each scorecard is going to be composed of different checks, which I want to go into a little bit more detail. These are a couple of examples. There's an additional 17 on top of these. Expect that list to keep growing. If we look at what a check is, it's a name, it's a description, it's a risk level associated with it. It's what level of access do you need to check it, and it's any other notes that help explain what it does. So for binary artifacts, this is a check that's looking to see, are there any binaries in the repo? Which is to say, is there any obfuscated source code in the repo? This is a high-level risk if there are binaries there, and this is something that Scorecard is checking for. So the second question on top of the criteria is really, how is this information getting populated? And so for that question, we want to be able to say, a scorecard is getting produced automatically. It's not something that people are filling out forms or are manually populating. Scorecards use GitHub's APIs in order to see which information or evidence is present such that we can say that a check exists or doesn't exist. And the way that API is called is really in one of two ways. Either a project is running the OpenSSF Scorecard's GitHub action, in which it runs just like other GitHub actions. When changes are made to that project, you can check for each of the individual scorecard checks. The other way that this is run is to have a local execution, just using a command line utility that still calls GitHub API for all of the information that's associated with the project. So that's the gist of Scorecard and what it is. Let's talk about how it's been doing so far. Right now, we have over 1,000 installs of our GitHub action. That number continues to grow. We have increasing numbers of people that are watching, forking, and starring the project. Right now, our focus is really on growth and increased adoption of Scorecard. So we want to continue to do things that will keep moving those numbers up. And we've also seen some positive traction when it comes to different foundations and organizations that have been using scorecards. Eclipse has been using this as a tool to help measure some of the security of its projects. Envoy has been using different pieces such that it is able to see whether or not scorecards could be a fit for more of its projects. It's actively giving feedback. And Sonatype has a couple of things that it's doing, but one of them that I'll talk about in just a second is that it used scorecards in some of its research to see how well it can help predict if a project is going to be vulnerable in the future. One other notable organization that's using it is the CNCF. There's a quote here from Chris talking about how the CNCF is using scorecards in dozens of its projects and in its Security Slam competition. So a little bit more about Sonatype. The full report is available online, and I recommend that everyone checks it out. It's Sonatype's annual State of Software Supply Chain report, and there's a specific section that talks about tools or indicators that can identify which projects are going to be vulnerable over time. Scorecards was one of the tools that was talked about in that section, and it can be used to gauge whether or not a project is going to have a high or low likelihood of incurring vulnerabilities in the future. There's also a breakdown of which specific checks within Scorecard provided higher or lower indications of whether or not a project would become vulnerable. Don't have time to get into the full research, but that's why I encourage everyone to just take a look at that report, and in particular, take a look at the sections on scorecards. So in terms of features that we have right now, I've already mentioned the existing GitHub action as a way to run scorecards. We also last year bootstrapped a project that is scanning the top 1.2 million open source repositories, and that the criteria for those projects was a rough measure of criticality. Naveen will go into that a little bit further. What that project is doing right now is undergoing some infrastructure tooling. So right now those scores are still essentially those of December of 2022. We expect that project to be back by the middle of this month. So those scores will be repopulated and become fresh again. The couple of things that are going to be discussed further in this talk are the API, which Naveen will go into more details, and we'll also talk about how you can add the OpenSSF Scorecards badge to a project. So with that, we'll transition back to our content in person, and I'll leave it to Naveen to go from there. Thank you again. Hi, everyone.
Sorry. Okay, thanks to Brian. One of the things that Brian mentioned is we released Scorecards API. why did we release the API? Prior to releasing the API, Scorecards has been running scans for almost a year, a little more than a year, for 1 to 1.2 million repositories. What it essentially means is it takes top 1 million repositories and runs a scorecard every week and takes the data and stores that into a BigQuery, and it's available for everyone to go get the data. But one thing we realized is when we spoke to customers or anybody who uses this, they found it'll be much more easier to provide a standard HTTP API over than going and hitting the BigQuery, which was a little jumping over the hoops. That led us to go build this API. This API is a standard HTTP API, which has GET and a POST. I'm going to get into details of what would GET do, what would POST do on this specifically. Where's this API? This API is available on api.securityscorecards.dev. And we also model this API specifically to make sure it's predictable. So here in this example, I have Kubernetes. Kubernetes, if you go hit this API or if you go hit the curl command for this should give you a JSON output to what's similar to what Brian showed in the video. Instead of it being a table format, and HTML will be a JSON output. So essentially, anybody should be able to replace Kubernetes with another project, and you should be able to get the results. If that project is either installed the GitHub action or it's part of the 1.2 million repositories. One of the critical things that we also made sure we did part of this API is you don't need any tokens. There's no authentication required. It's public good instance. So essentially, anybody should be able to utilize this API. Second thing is we are not throttling any requests right now. So please don't DDoS this. So what does this API serve? The GET serves the 1.2 million repositories. So essentially, if you have a dependency and you're like, okay, how do I know this dependency is good? Oh, I see a Sonatype report that says, oh, figure out are these projects using GitHub scans, but how do I know that? And this is the idea behind providing an API to go hopefully get results on any of your dependencies to use this API. At this moment, like Brian mentioned, we are going through some restructuring of the infrastructure, but it should be back up. But still, the existing data is still there. We released this API in the fall of last year. We are seeing about 85,000 to 100,000 requests every day. Who's using the API? To be honest, we don't know. We don't know who's using the API. If anyone is using, we get these kind of GitHub issues wherein we went and looked at this person. This person was a university student in Europe. That's what we know. We don't know who's using this API, to be honest. This is great that we have this API, but what can we answer with this API? So we decided, okay, what can we answer this API? How can people take it back to their own organizations and figure out what they can answer? So we decided, how about us trying to run code review? Code review is one of the checks within Scorecard. So essentially utilize that check to figure out for the top 1,000 critical projects. How did we come up with top 1,000 critical projects? We didn't come up with that. There's another OpenSSF project called Criticality Score. It's a great project. Please go look at that if you have time, or if you want to know how the project, to figure out what are the most critical projects. It's based on one of the algorithms by Rob Pike, and we utilized that data from that, and we took the top 1,000 critical projects. We said, let's hit the API with these top 1,000 critical projects and see how are they doing. Looks like most of them are doing well, except a few of them, but this is good. So essentially, we know where we want to spend our time on in trying to solve these problems. The next thing is a similar check is something called binary artifacts, like what Brian mentioned. We went and saw the top 1,000 critical projects. It looks like most of them are doing really well. A very teensy bit of them require some help. But these are the questions that you should be able to answer on your dependencies as to how do I know these are doing well? Okay, enough with slides, right? Just show me the code. Okay. Okay, sorry, this is way too small. Okay. I think, okay. This is written in Go. So what I'm showing right now is the code that I use for doing the previous graph, the pie chart, but not the pie chart, but just the data for the pie chart. So I'm familiar with Go, Scorecard is written in Go, but essentially anybody should be able to use any programming language to get this. The meat of this code is essentially what you see here is the get score. Like I mentioned, it does not have any tokens, anything. It goes and gets that repository, whichever repository you're looking for. Gets the JSON output from that, deserializes to a struct, and you should be able to get the data. And I take here, I'm jumping on top. I take the top 1,000 critical projects that I was able to download from the GitHub repository, from the criticality score, go take that simultaneously, go hit the API, and should be able to get the results of this. I'm going to jump back to the slides. Where can you find this code? This code is available for anybody to go get it. It's under my own personal repository, but anybody should be able to utilize this code, fork, clone, get this as an example to go hit them for their own organization or projects, whatever they are working on. Okay, usually I do this with Brian, but Brian is not there, so I'm going to play a little game to figure out what is the usefulness of this API. I am going to be the contributor. I'm going to play the similar role as Brian. Brian is usually playing the security maintainer hat. I'm going to go to Brian. I want to submit a PR with a new dependency. Is this dependency in a healthy state? Would a scorecard be helpful? What's a scorecard? Brian, have you checked out the scorecards repo? This is great. I'm going to use the API for checking for all my future dependencies. I'll use this in my CI/CD workflow. It's so easy to use. Why isn't everyone using it? Our goal was so that people understand. We are, in fact, thinking about working on a GitHub action to make this possible within Scorecard project. So essentially, if you add a new dependency, our goal is to provide you the Scorecard result in GitHub PR comment. So essentially, you'll be able to make a decision as to whether you want to take it or not. We are working on that. Hopefully, no promises, but hopefully by Q1, end of Q1, that's what we are trying to get to that. Okay. Like I mentioned, the Scorecards API has two things. One is the Scorecards get, the API had get, and next is the post, and that's where the badges are. The reason for the badges to essentially, obviously, to showcase what is your health of your open source dependency, so that anybody who can come to your project knows how is that project doing, so it makes it easier for human beings to go look at that. Sorry. Okay, I don't know if many of you are aware, the logo on the left is Scorecards, the logo on the right is SIG-Store. Scorecards love SIG-Store. So why am I saying this? Scorecards GitHub action uses SIG-Store for doing its job. So not many of them are aware of that, but I just want to throw that out. this demo is going to be more of a can demo so that it makes it easier for, this is probably going to be for a minute. So the whole idea of this demo is to showcase how easy it is to install a scorecard action. So you should be able to go to a scorecards repository and go click on the scorecards badge, just copy that, go to your own repository, click on your README, and you should be able to paste that, and then just change the owner and the repository in that section, in those two places, and you should be able to get a badge. But I'm going to throw a little caveat to this. One of the things is, if your repository is already part of the 1.2 million repository that we scan, either that or if you need to install the GitHub action, only with these two stuff. Those are only two ways you can get a badge. But that does, if you can still run the action, but if you decide it's a private repository that I don't want to share the results, then you should still be good. Okay, so we are obviously looking for contributors, and if you want to come and hang out on our Slack channel, any of that, you should be able to hit us up over here. We meet every bi-weekly between 1 and 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Thank you. Questions?
Hey, Thomas from EBM Systems. I'm familiar with the Scorecard project, but I'm kind of missing two things. So I develop a kind of an open SCA solution, so we can scan thousands of dependencies. But if I understand Scorecard correctly, it only has a limited index on what is currently a scorecard. So I actually have two questions. If we add scorecards to our project and we compute it for every dependency, do you accept that we upstream the data to the scorecard project? Because you only have the top 1,000 projects.
So you want to essentially add 1,000 more projects to the scorecard's existing scan?
So to give you a scale, we collectively, probably the whole community in our project runs about 100,000 scans per day. That's God knows incredibly amount of open source dependencies for which we have the source code and which we can technically run the scorecard thing on. Are you open to contributing all of the data that we have if we do this upstream? So you have an API or point that I can just say, I run scorecard over this repository, here you go, this is the outcome.
So we are ready to take, if you want to scan, say, 1,000 more projects, you can come and add that to do a PR to our repository, we should be able to do that. But we don't take the data from anybody, we can run the scans for you, if that's the question you're looking for.
Yeah, so I would just want to call the API on the fly with any project and on the fly have a compute what the score is.
Yes, so you should be able, okay. So you want to use the API to push data to scorecards? Okay. It's a little tricky on that because we don't trust. How do we trust that whatever you're pushing is valid? Anybody can game the system. So in Open Source North America Summit, hopefully I've submitted a CFP to talk about how the internals of how do you trust the scorecard if there's a GitHub action running on something else, and that's what we use Sigstore, and we just don't trust. We got to have a zero trust confidence to run this, and that's why we don't allow anybody to do a post. Only if you use the GitHub action, only then you can post data to that API.
Yeah, so okay, understood. Second question, so my project has a scorecard, but the scorecard is incorrect. Do you what is the best practices?
If you don't mind, can you keep the mic? I can't.
Oh, sorry. My project runs the scorecard, since we follow all the best practices from LF, because we're an LF project. But sometimes the scorecard is wrong. Do you the engineering best practices allow the maintainers to correct the data, since the tool doesn't correctly identify particular things?
Yes. So there are a couple of things on this. Not every scorecard being an automated tool, we are trying to do our best, and we are coming up with a way so that a project can say, it's okay, we are aware of this isn't an issue, a settings, a file so that we don't ding you for having that check not being done. But people can game the system, so we are coming up with 2 scores. One is with that settings file, wherein you can override that, and one is raw scores without that. So essentially, consumers of scorecard data can figure out which one to go about. Thanks. Okay, thank you.